Hello, this is Chewing the Gristle with my friend and co-host, Tim Conroy. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, brother Al, how you doing?
And today we're going to interview the poet and environmentalist and educator, David Taylor. Hi, David.
Hey, how are you, Al? Hey, Tim.
Wonderful. Poet David Taylor is an assistant professor of environmental humanities in the Sustainability Studies program, housed in the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University. His writing crosses disciplinary boundaries and genres: scholarship, science, technical writing, creative nonfiction, and poetry. However, at the core of his work always is an interest in and concern for environmental sustainability and community. He is the author and editor of 9 books. Poetry books include Palm Up, Palm Down, The Log from the Sea of Cortez, a poetry series, and Praying Up the Sun. He is the co-editor of the upcoming Paumanok Rising Again, Long Islanders Reflect on Climate Change, under contract with SUNY Press, and is lead editor and contributor to An Island in the Stream, Eco-Critical and Literary Responses to Cuban Environmental Culture. He was also lead editor and contributor to Sushi in Cortez, essays from years collaborating with writers, artists, and scholars at the Consejo Nacional Arts. It's Spanish, I'm very sorry. It's a foundation. It's a wonderful organization, I'm sure, with the Union of National, I'm going to let him explain that. But he's also been involved with Cuban National Writers Organization, the Department of Geography at the University of Havana, and recent scholar essays on Cuban theater. He's the lead editor of Theater as Environmental Education, Minding Nature, Center for Humans and Nature, and is lead editor of a special section on Cuban theater and sustainability outreach. Welcome, David. And if you could correct my Spanish on that organization, I would be more than happy.
So it's called the Consejo Nacional Artistas y Escritores, which is it's the sort of national group of performing artists and writers. To be a licensed artist, whether you're a writer, a painter, or a performer, or a musician in Cuba, you have to have gone through testing by experts, and then you receive a government salary. Welcome to socialism and art under socialism. So to be part of the CNAE, or the Consejo Nacional Artistas y Escritores, it's like that's kind of a designation of that the artist community sort of respects your work.
Okay, so that means you're no longer a starving artist like many of us.
Yeah, it is for, and again, and this is the one where doing work in Cuba is an interesting study. Some of my dearest friends are there, and obviously there are differences of opinions between our governments on appropriate government. So they and I don't really have conversations about, democracy and socialism. But it's been a really good experience over the years of going down there, about 7 years now, and working with writers and some of the environmental scientists and some of the performing artists. And again, always focused on this question of sustainability and art as a form of outreach and engagement.
Oh, okay. Would you tell us about your poetry journey and education and who your influences were and are?
Sure. So years ago, now many decades ago, when I was an undergraduate, I always enjoyed being kind of an outdoors person. I always enjoyed my time rambling in the woods from when I was a little kid. And when I started my undergraduate studies, I thought, well, you know, I'll probably study biology or something and become a field biologist. And then I took my first biology class, and it was the absolute worst, most boring experience I had in my life. It just numbed me. And of course, there was no talk of getting outside. And so then I thought, well, damn it. So at the same time, I was taking this class in writing. And again, at that time, there weren't creative writing classes at that university back in the early 80s. And but the professor was really a great professor. And he was particularly interested in Victorian poetry. And so he gave me some Matthew Arnold poems to read. And he told me this story of Matthew Arnold as a 14-year-old boy, that the Arnold family summer house was up in the Lake District, and it was only about a mile or so away from Wordsworth's house. And as a little boy, Matthew Arnold would walk over to Rydal Mount and ask Wordsworth to read him some poetry. And I remember hearing that and knowing, and Arnold writes about this a little bit, and you could hear these poems. And I just remember thinking that my experiences and my time in the woods started to sound like the best of what I felt in language and what I felt in poetry. And then as I began then to think more and more about this, I realized that my connections and my love with especially folk music and my sort of passion for being outdoors and my passion for language really had a kind of connection. And it was really pushed forward by my English professors for the first few years, and then later in philosophy and in my PhD program. So it really began in that same sense of, I love being outdoors, I love being able to look and listen to things, and then finding out that poetry really has a certain kind of resonance with that. It's not so different.
Tim.
And that's a fabulous response. And I want to ask you, just sort of to get us started, tell us a little bit about what you think your poetry style is. What is your poetry style, and what do you try to do in your poetry?
Yeah, this is a hard question. Most of my poetry tends to sort of focus on these moments that I have that tend to be outdoors, or probably hit some moment of some kind of intense human relationship. And I say intense meaning that it really strikes me, something that I heard with a certain style or a language. And in some ways, to me, that reflects some of the things I pay attention to when I'm outdoors and I hear a certain bird call. Like I was talking to Drew Lathan the other day, and I was asking him about particular blue jay calls this time of year, early in the morning, that start to sound like Cooper's hawk calls. And we were talking about how that could happen and why they might do that. And these are the same things when what I wanted, I think, in my poetry is to sort of capture that sense of attention, that really careful thought of, I am listening to you, my friend, my partner, my daughter, my community. And also I am listening to you, blue jays, I'm listening to you, tree leaves, I'm listening to you, here since I'm on Long Island, the sort of tidal movements. And I think, at least in the kind of poetry I work at, I think of it probably along the lines of attentiveness and this idea of listening. And strangely, I think, at least for nature writing, the more careful you are as a listener and the more attentive you are, the more that style and construction takes care of itself in a certain way, because the attention will give you so much of that if you're really, really paying attention.
No, your poetry is so grounded in images and imagery of the natural world, and so your response about listening and observing just really makes sense to me after reading your poems.
Oh, thank you.
What makes a good poem, David? What for you? What makes it a poem that you want to read, that you want to spend time with?
Another thoughtful question. This is the one I would say the musicality of the poem is probably as important to me. Like, I write mostly nature writing poetry, but I don't really often read as much of it, maybe. Like, I certainly don't limit my reading. I'm really more fascinated at times with just the language and the kind of, and how it can work. Like, there's an old friend, Jim Clark, who does these poems, and he's a really great folk musician. And sometimes it's really nice to go, I can't tell if what I'm reading here is a folk song that's on a page, or if it's a poem that he's singing, and it's that beautiful line that I see that. There's a number of poets. I think Alison Deming does this beautiful thing sometimes where she just falls into this style. Pattiann Rogers, especially her big sort of long, very lush language does the same thing for me. It's that sense that that I'm just caught up in the way it sounds. And I always tell people this, and I know my partner thinks I'm a little nuts, but I walk around on the back porch reading poetry out loud, because just to read it on the page in the morning, I don't know, it takes something away. And I don't know if the birds like it or not, but they get to listen, because I will be walking around the back porch reading stuff out loud in the morning. And it sounds to me the way I don't know, to me, that's what captures me. That's when I get pulled in.
Why do so many scientists gravitate towards poetry?
This is an interesting one, and I think it's a fascinating question. So, I am the lone humanities professor in a school of marine and atmospheric science, and I know nothing, again, about marine or atmospheric science. I didn't really even see the ocean until I moved up here, because I was a sort of north central Texan, right? We didn't know the ocean existed. So moving up here, it's been fascinating to me that, as I found this place in the sustainability program, teaching some of the sort of more ethics and humanities-based questions around sustainability and conservation and preservation. Talking with the scientists, I think the interesting thing is they would say the one thing that they really admire about poetry is this same question of care, the same thing of there's not a lot of wasted space. There's not a lot of wasted words. There's a lot of, and actually, again, Alison Deming writes about this in her book on in her essay on poetry and science, and she says the one thing that poetry and science agree on is avoiding sentimentality. That quality science and quality poetry don't fall into naive sort of facile relationships, that you're digging in deeply and you're paying attention for a very long time to come up with data on one hand, and then I would say on the other, inductive reflection, which then becomes poetry.
That's a wonderful response. How about dig us in a little deeply here and read a few poems? Read a couple poems for us.
Okay, so I'm going to read you a poem written from a book I did that was about reading a book, if that makes any sense. So in 1940, John Steinbeck had gotten all this money from the award for the Grapes of Wrath, and everybody was coming to Monterey to drink with him. And not that John Steinbeck minded drinking with people, but he got a little worn out with it. And one of his closest friends was a biologist named Ed Ricketts. And it's the one where, so he gave money to Ed Ricketts to do an expedition on the interior of the Sea of Cortez. And so they spent 6 weeks along with the crew, and they collected intertidal species along the inside of the Sea of Cortez. And this became the book called The Sea of Cortez. And in it, what Steinbeck did is Ed Ricketts took these careful notes about their work and their reflection. And John Steinbeck took Ricketts' notes and made it into a journal about their trip. And it became a reflection on this notion of science, community, and humanities. And when I read the book, I got so moved by it, I wrote a collection of poetry about the book. And so there's a line in it where they've taught the crew how to collect all these species when the tides are out in these tidal pools. And Ricketts is looking at them all, and everybody's bent over collecting, and they then are just collecting, but they're no longer having any fun. And in the line, it says, that's the problem, is we get into this mindset as collectors that we only focus on one thing. And so Ricketts, and then later Steinbeck, has the line that goes, "It is advisable to look from the tide pool to the stars and back to the tide pool again." So this is sort of this time when they're all sitting there doing it. It's called From the Tide Pool to the Stars. We've done our best to collect, and yes, we've killed all along this trip. We've taken life to eat. We've taken life to name. We've robbed the tide pools of as much as we could hold and stabbed at a manta with a rusty harpoon we bought from a native, watched the horn shark die on the deck of the boat for 17 hours, not moving, blood pooling on its skin and goat-slit eyes, staring and staring until Tiny the deckhand could watch no more for fear of his soul. We have eaten yellowfin tuna raw and alive. It turned sweet in our mouths. We've tossed around crude words and stories dressed down to our convenience as we walked through the ciudades muy tranquila, the very peaceful cities, and let our eyes linger as we were walking in behind the grandmother's doors. For all of our earthy ways, we've had times too that stilled us, and we shifted our eyes from the tide pool to star and back again. We knew then that we were collecting ourselves, naming and renaming, rethinking our roots and limbs, calling each other newly by names we had already used, because we began to know each other. And knowing is also not knowing, always a beginning to how we were connected. The something that Jesus and Darwin had in common, living in the same old house, taking collection notes as prayer.
Wonderfully done. For many of us, and there's many different opinions, but we really want yours. How much time do you take on revision? And when do you know that the poem is finished?
This is a good question. This was one of Whitman's problems, is he never thought a poem was finished, right? And so he was always revising and always revising. And so I would say before I ever send a poem out to be looked at, it probably goes through at least 10 to 15 revisions. I don't trust anything I write the first time and get it to someplace, because usually it's really messy and I don't know what it's even trying to say. I also think, though, my editor hat is very different than my writing hat. So I don't know about you guys. I get up early in the morning. I spent this summer building a writing shack in the backyard just to get away from the house that I live in by myself, because I just wanted something a little bit even more sort of remote, to have that time to sit and write. And then again, that time of editing and knowing when a poem is ready to be sent out, I think it really comes back to when the poem is telling me to leave it alone. That I've probably been messing around with it long enough. And I think that's probably then when I start realizing my edits are becoming more and more fastidious and maybe not even necessary, and I start moving things around, and I send it to a couple of friends and we argue about line breaks, and then it's like, yeah, it probably needs somebody to look at it out there. but I'll also say it's like if I don't know about how you guys feel about this. Every time I see a poem on a page that's been printed, I immediately start going, well, yeah, I could have done it this way, or I could have done it that way, and right. It's like fiddling around where you just always have that feeling, and again, I think a lot of it too has changed for me, where as my life has moved from Texas to Long Island, it's really come back to this question of my life here and the work that I do at the university and the teaching is so different than what I did before. I think that's probably wanting me to think differently than I did. I'm probably trying to work at I think probably different kinds of style, and I think even different kinds of language and musicality, because the accents here are so different than what I'm used to as a Texan. That I'm slowly trying to pay attention to what's here, and I think that really impacts the way that I'm going about the editing. I think it's my poetry has really changed in part because of listening to that.
That's a wonderful response. I read poems out of my books at readings, and I change the poem as I'm reading. I'm sure you've done the same.
Yeah.
Do you steer a poem, or does the poem steer you when you're writing?
When I'm writing, the poem, I would say the poem steers me. I always love this question from some of my friends who are not writers, and they're like, well, how do you write? And I'm like, I have no idea how I write. I mean, you know this, right? It's like, okay, I was a kid. I started sitting down with a journal and having a beer, and I'd sit by myself and I'd have a book in front of me and I'd start writing. And I don't know for you, but I can say for me, there's a kind of voice that comes that I have to pay attention to. And if I honor that voice with time, and especially for me, a kind of ritual morning where I get up, it's 5 o'clock, I wander out to my shack, I turn on the light, I sit down for a little bit and, kind of just breathe, and then I get to work. The voice, that sort of voice that comes then is pretty consistent, and not always, sometimes a little more than others. But I don't know, like, I know that voice is caught up with, my history and background with stories and style and everything I learned from, my family about telling stories. But I think that part is the poem writing itself. I think the other part is me shaping that into what I think of as a more crafted artifact down the road. But I think initially it's always listening. I really, at least for me, it always comes from listening.
Who are you reading now as poets?
So yeah, I've been going back with a lot of kind of newer ones where, Drew's book on Sparrow Envy has been one that's really been a big part of my reading. One of my old friends, Robert Michael Pyle, who's one of America's leading butterfly experts, writes some beautiful poetry. He is trained as a scientist, but his poetry more recently has gotten really quite beautiful. Alison Deming is always an inspiration to me. Anne McDowell, and then of course Camille Dungy and some others, are always those kinds of poets who really, I think, strike me as having voices that slow me down. And so I kind of move along that line. I tend to read people who are writing about the natural world a little more often. But yeah, I make a point to read at least 10 to 15 minutes of poetry a day, no matter what. That's going to happen. I've been doing that probably since I was 19.
Okay. Would you share a poem or two again with us?
So my dad, I don't know about you guys. So my dad was a good old West Texan and barely finished high school at about 21 because he was working in the fields in the fall. So he didn't go to high school much of the time then. And he was, as he said, wasn't the best student anyway. But I learned so much about language and storytelling from my dad because he was the best liar I've ever heard. And I've never heard the same story the same way. But man, he understood nuance, and he understood the way you tell a story. So I always tell people, it's like, yeah, inevitably I went into English really because my dad was just a great storyteller. But my dad used to have these things where in Texas, because the wind blows all the time, he would have those whirligigs in the backyard, some kind of bird and the little propeller wings would be flying around and flying around. So one time I was thinking about that when I moved up here. So it's called What I Believe. What I believe of weather turns with the squeaky sound of a backyard whirligig, shaped like a gargantuan hummingbird, propeller wings beating, spinning, pointing to the direction of the wind. I too can follow something more than joy, than my desk and field guides, the orange coals in the fireplace. Beyond my window, everything is always new. The angle of the sun, the bark beetle larvae gnawing its way in the dead pitch pine, a red-bellied woodpecker darting from trunk to trunk and tapping in a direction only the twisting eelgrass and the bluefin can know. I know nothing, no thing, not one thing, but syllables of patterns, sounds in uniform chant, gate, gate, pater gate, following the hints of barred owl calls. So in the Heart Sutra, there's this line toward the end, is gate, gate, pater gate, parasum gate bodhisvaha, and it's just gone, gone, already gone, is what it's kind of saying. So yeah, it's that idea of, maybe sometimes I'll pay more attention when I'm willing to let go of listing all the things I know and just sort of really pay attention. So.
I want to hear another one.
Oh, all right. So let me see. I lived in Arizona for a while, and one of the people I met there was a folk singer, writer, and environmental activist named Katie Lee. Katie was one of the most inspiring people I ever met in my life. She, in her mid-80s, would still ride her bike nude through town. Just loved, she was most inspired. She wanted to always tear down the dam at Lake Mead to sort of free up Glen Canyon. So she was part of a group called the Glen Canyon Dam group that wants to tear down the dam still, because she was riding the rivers back in the 50s and was always an activist to save them. But she told me the story once when she was a young folk singer in Hollywood, that Burl Ives was hitting on her the whole time. And he was just trying the best he could. And she just kept saying, no, I ain't going to do it. And so finally, one time he said, well, let me take you to dinner. And he had a present for her. And it was like, okay, here's a present. And then she opened it, and there's a box and a box and a box. And finally, in the last little box, there was just a note, and it said, Katie, don't take away a person's anticipation. Sometimes that's all we got. And so this is, I was working at a store one time, and they were playing those music kind of loop things. And I'm listening to Burl Ives singing Have a Holly Jolly Christmas. And it made me think of Katie Lee. So this is called When Burl Ives Comes a-Callin'. Burl Ives' voice comes on every 45 minutes over the store speakers, hawking Christmas wares. Have a holly jolly Christmas. I've never separated his voice from the holidays, Dr. Seuss stories, things playful. Now a 40-year-old man, hearing his voice this way tires me. This evening, minding a beer and a small fire in my backyard, watching the dog chase mourning dove, pushed here by the last cold front, I got your Christmas card. 3 colors of ink. You wrote off to Baja for a month, even a picture of the rock by the Sea of Cortez. I remember the story. Burl tried to seduce you, a gift within a gift within, and a note about the importance of anticipation. The horny old bastard, you called him, laughing. So lovely and so kind. The evening I met you, the most beautiful 80-year-old I've ever seen, talking of the lives of rivers and writing and Glen Canyon and that fucker Dominy, Floyd Dominy. You asked me to stretch out my legs on the couch across your lap, draped your hands across them, and you winked. You are a flirt and alive. And even as the store speakers and all the shopping robs Burl's voice, your whole being resurrects it, reminds me when I was young, aware and conscious of my body, wild in its muscle and edge, like the shape of canyons beneath.
That's great.
Yeah, she was a great old gal.
Hey, well, I want to ask this question I've asked every person we've interviewed, is advice to the emerging writer or poet about working through mediocrity, working through the frustration of getting better.
All right.
What advice would you give them, David?
I remember when I was young and was writing, and, you know, again, they didn't have creative writing classes when I was young. And so I would bug some of my English professors who were also poets to read some of mine. I would read theirs. I'd go to poetry readings, and I would see these people with a poetry chapbook or book maybe, and you know, they would have this list of stuff after their names that made them seem like they had done a lot of stuff, and they had. And I remember feeling like I wanted to be a part of their world. And I look back at it, and the one thing I think I wish I had rethought was, I think I was looking for some notion of attention and whatever fame there is in poetry, which I'm not sure there's a whole lot, but y'all might know that better than I am. But more so the sense that I thought of it as this sort of, oh, I want to be a part of that community so I can garner attention. And the one thing it's taken me over my life to realize probably more than anything is, no, I want to shape the community that I want my poetry to be a part of. I want a community of, like I have here on Long Island, where one of my best friends is probably the best marine naturalist. And I have, on the other hand, this other guy who's a great musician and makes boutique guitar amps, like tube guitar amps. And I've got this other friend who works for Cornell Extension, working with all of the organic farms on the island. And, you know, I realize my poetry and my writing have a place in that community that allows me to listen and marvel. And we're all artists of our kinds. But I think in some ways that's the one where I used to think, well, I want to fit into this larger poetry community, and I do. And certainly as you get older and you keep working at it, you will build this. But it's also the sense that I want a community that's my friends here who aren't necessarily poets. They can be. I mean, I'm thrilled. But I want people who are attentive to their passion and to their lives, and that they see that I'm doing the same. And in that way, my poetry has a service in that community. And that may not mean I'm going to get into the most prestigious publications, but as I've kept working at it, I realized my poetry has gone from, I don't know if the right word is, it's ever gotten a whole lot better than mediocre, but I would say I know why I want it more, which I think makes it a better art. I think it's more careful, and I think it's more crafted just from the years of working at it. But I think it's also more in the service of the community that I care about. And that to me is something that I think in poetry especially, and maybe in folk music, that tradition of folk music is you don't have to sing well, You just have to sing loudly, right? And that's the one I think in poetry, maybe that too is what we need to keep in mind. You know, the little poetry slams at the coffee houses are wonderful. Those things that are going on in the public libraries, by God, I'd put some of that poetry up against whatever Yale Younger Series winner we got this year. Because in some ways, to me, those groups are serving a community in a more immediate way than the other sort of professional organization. And so to my mind, that's the service of poetry that I hope has moved mine from this notion of mediocrity to service, which I think also means more crafted and more careful over the years of doing it.
I love that response. It's just something that really everybody needs to hear. Brother Al, I'm gonna shoot it over to you.
You know, we don't create in a vacuum.
No.
None of us do. What resources or books would you recommend to the poetry community?
Well, you know, sometimes for me, like it would be too easy for me to just start going down the list of natural history books that I go to all the time for me. But I know the book, strangely, one of the books that really impacted me when I was a little kid was Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. And I just remember that it finally started talking to me about this notion, like I was mentioning earlier, of listening to this voice and paying attention and honoring that voice that comes to you, at least for me, early in the morning. And I remember that book really made me think especially about these notions of why you do it and what is it you're wanting out of it. And you know, that's the one where that book really, really impacted me in the way that I think about that. There's a few other books that I go to pretty often. I'm trying to think that actually, like right now, you know, my readings are between John Lane's new novel, a book on the color blue, which has been really fascinating. And it's that one where then I'll mix it up because I have a book on cormorants I'm going to start reading. But I guess I would go back and think, I'm really trying to think of some of the books that really made me really rethink some things. So there was a book back when by Barry Lopez called Of Wolves and Men. And it's the first book that he spent a great deal of time with wolf biologists looking at the good science of wolves. And then the second part of the book was looking at the world mythologies of wolves and looking at these careful connections between the ways we've constructed myths and stories about wolves and our relationship with wolves, and even canines for that matter, to then seeing how our perceptions have been shaped by the biology of the wolf and the stories that we've been given. And I remember that connecting in my head, that realizing the stories I've been told and the myths that I've inherited shape the way that I see the things around me. And that was also a sort of, I remember how that really shook me up, how it really changed the way I was thinking about that. And two, yeah, there's a number of other ones. Some of the Margaret Atwood novels, Ursula Le Guin novels, all of those had also a lot of impact.
Hey, David, how can people get hold of your collection, palm up and palm down? What's the best way?
Probably the best way is, sadly, through Amazon. I don't always agree with wanting to buy books through Amazon, by the way. I feel really bad about it. But right now, that's probably the best way. The books from Wings Press are being distributed. And two of the books are from there. And then, unfortunately, Pecan Grove Press, that was run by a wonderful poet and a guy in Texas, Palmer Hall. He passed away a few years ago, and they haven't found somebody to pick up the mantle of that press right now. So that one is more or less, if you want one, send me an email at Stony Brook, and I've got a copy for you if you want one.
Well, that's great. And Brother Al.
Yes. Could you share one more poem with us?
Sure. I was trying to think of one. Actually, let me do it this way. I got one pulled up here. This is one that I haven't sent out yet. I think it's going to be in a book coming out in another couple of years with a collection on nature and poetry. So this is called Birdsong. And so my house is in the middle of what in Long Island we call the Pine Barrens. It's out on the east end before you get to the Forks. And in the Pine Barrens, there's a lot of these natural lakes that we call kettle ponds, because back when the glaciers were here, there would be an enormous iceberg that would actually sit, and it would actually, as the glaciers receded, that would stay there and it would leave this hole in the ground. And if the water table is high enough, then you end up with a kettle pond. And behind my house is the wetlands to a kettle pond about 200 yards away. So I can go back and put my kayak in my backyard and go down to the kettle pond. That's called Swan Pond. So that's the reference here. So this is called Birdsong. The ride of birds in the wetlands as the sun rises above Swan Pond tells me to notice the sun rising above the dawn-edged pitch pines and stretchy scarlet oaks. My coffee is all the more sharp because of the squawks of the blue jays, the northern flickers calling out, catbirds mimicking the remaining spring peepers. A Carolina wren flitting low across the yard to forest, nesting in a kayak left out over winter. I guess it's the reason we all sing, partner, place, and communal chorus, to have one's voice fit in with more than one. In offering song, have song returned. And now in mourning, it's all the clearer. When I listen just as intently, the words in the journal on the table take wing too. Call out as though morning bird song, and lift from the page as I read them aloud. Hello, good morning. And I'll keep writing, more awake, in song, and listening.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And the way you ended it, it's important that we listen.
Yeah.
We listen to each other, nature, the world around us. We want to thank you, David. We want to encourage the folks that come and listen to your interview to buy his books, investigate what he has to say, and to write for themselves. So thank you very much, poet David Taylor.
Thank you, Al, and thank you, Tim. It's been great. It's so much fun. And this is, by the way, so important for our communities to hear people take the time to talk about a craft and to talk about the culture around that craft, not just from the artist perspective, but also the people who are interested in it. And I think that, to me, is the best part of what I've learned over the years, is in finding your right communities, whether they're human and they're non-human, is finding your place within them and being a good member and paying, giving what you can in your own art, and then also listening to others, listening to their art, whether it's a human art or a non-human art. Either one works. So thank you again so much.